Blessed be your name when I'm found in
We want to continue our series, Can We Talk? And tonight we want to talk about why work is essential to expanding the kingdom. When God created each one of us, He also gave us primary giftings. Did you know that? You were created with God in mind, or God had you in mind, and He created in you primary giftings. You carry those things around with you to help motivate us to do His work. In other words, you're going to find certain things in your life that you're really going to like to do, and I'm telling you that inward motivation comes from a God that gave you that. There are gifts of mercy, leadership, helps, administration, encouragement, giving, etc. You can find those in Romans chapter 12, and those are called motivational gifts. And all of us have been given gifts, but not all of them. Understand that. Not all of them. Primary and usually one or two. So, therefore, we function better when operating in what God has given to us. Now, let me explain that to you. When you find your sweet spot, or whatever it is, and you find your place of serving wherever that might be, in the church or outside the church, you just simply know that this is where I belong. This is what's happening in my life, and you love it there. But what often happens is this. So therefore, I will function in this, and I'll neglect other things that God wants me to do because there's motivation there, and that's not true. But that doesn't mean because I don't have the primary gift of an evangelist, therefore I'm not supposed to practice sharing my faith. That's just for those evangelist people. You see, that's not for me. Well, according to the Scriptures, it's for all of us. This is the reason the Apostle Paul writes back to Timothy. Now, let me tell you about Timothy and the two books that Paul wrote to Timothy about. These are pastoral books. And the reason that Paul is writing back to Timothy is because Timothy has taken over the church at Ephesus. And the church at Ephesus is about 50,000 strong, as near as we can tell. And so he needs some encouragement. So Paul is writing back to Timothy, and he's saying, Timothy, I want you to pay attention to this, because Timothy was Paul's protege, or he was his student. Timothy's primary gifts were probably pastoring and teaching, so he spent his energies there, and rightfully so. So Paul is telling Timothy, you must practice those primary giftings, but don't stop sharing your faith. Now, I could be reading into the text, but I believe Paul is saying, don't just hang around churched people. Now, why am I saying that? Is it just something that comes to my mind because it fits into this series? No, because Paul was a church planter. And when you read the New Testament, and especially how Paul started churches, he always hung around unchurched people. And he is saying, listen, Timothy, I get it. I know what is easiest for you. But I want you to begin to spend time with unchurched people. You just kind of get in a groove and you start practicing that, and you think that that's what your church life is all about. Friends, I have to be really honest with you. I'm preaching about something I really don't understand. And there's always a tension in that. I mean, if you waited for your pastor or teaching pastors to wait until their life is perfected before we ever spoke about something, you would never get any message. So we're in process too. We're in this thing of learning how to do it ourselves. But I have to be really honest with you. Right now in my life, as near as I can calculate, I have two unchurched friends. And the reason why is because I have sown into the church. And so I have thousands of church friends. And it is really hard to break out of that scenario and how to find unchurched people. And I believe that is exactly the dynamic that's going on in Timothy's life. He has found what it is to be a pastor and all the rest of it, and now he has to break out of that mode and learn how to get back in to the mainstream of what everybody is doing in their life. We are like water. We will seek the path of least resistance. Every one of us. It's just the way we're made. It's easier to do it this way. If doing this work of expanding the kingdom was easy, everyone would be doing it and the world would know. It's just not easy work, and that's why Paul says, do the work of an evangelist. Because it is spelled W-O-R-K. It's work. There's a dynamic that takes place when a church decides to reach out, and that first dynamic is this. The workload will immediately increase. You know why? is because now all the energies that were given to the inside of the church, some of those energies are now going to the outside of the church. And I'll say this to every one of you. It takes an incredibly mature church to love the unchurched. You know why? It's because you don't get what you want. It's about other people. I noticed there are no amens on that. But that's what happens. And then the other thing that begins to take place is this. Then you throw the dynamic, and when people start understanding this, we're dealing with people's eternities. It adds another stair of emphasis, and we recognize that we're really playing for all the stakes. And so the energies that we have now that are not just being directed, and this is one of the reasons, friends, I got a lot of comments. Excuse me, I get all choked up when I talk about my counselor. But got a lot of comments last week when I told you that I'm seeing a counselor, emails and people coming up to me and talking, and it was all that good stuff. But I want you to know this is the paradox, and I have lots of paradoxes in my life. But this is a paradox. How do we continue to mature the church and continue to reach out? And it's a really difficult balance to do both. Because we are dealing with people's eternities, and near as I can tell, the heart of God is, I want you to continue to reach out to those people that don't know the Lord. One of the reasons this work is so difficult is basically this. We are dealing with disinterested people. They're not interested in their eternities, and I'll be making more comments about that later. And so when we start to talk to somebody and we find out that they're not interested, what do we feel? I can tell you it's one word. Rejection. And when you're rejected, you don't feel like going out and putting your heart on the platter for somebody else to step on it again. And so what the immediate response is to this is that I'll withdraw because I didn't have a receptive audience to what I had to say. Paul is trying to encourage Timothy, do this work. I know it's not easy. Do this work. I want to give us some hints how we can do this work as well. So if you have your little outlines, listen to this in 2 Timothy 4:5. But you, now this is Paul talking to Timothy. I want you to hear this, what Paul is saying to Timothy. But you, keep your head in all situations. How many of you wished that you had kept your head in all situations? It's just multiplied in the ministry. Endure hardship. Now there's one that somebody ought to preach on. Endure hardship. Do the work of an evangelist. Discharge all the duties of your ministry. I had a friend ask me tonight, he says, well, where's your scripture? Because I usually have it on the back. That's it. That's all there is tonight. So 5 ways to work. Number 1 is this. Decide that my faith will not just be about me. Decide that my faith will not just be about me. All of us are driven to a point or a crossroads that will determine what our lives will be about. Now, let me just tell you about this, friends. When this begins to take place in your life, I want you to know it is not your own ingenuity that is bringing you to this crossroads or this apex in your life. It is God. And God has an ability to bring you to a place, and I'll repeat this again. This kind of an experience with God is repeatable. It's not just once. It's not just once we lay our life down. It's numbers of times that we learn to lay our lives down. And so what happens to us when God brings us to this crossroad, I want you to know these 2 crossroads are marked very clearly. One of them says this, eternal, and the other one says temporary. And when we come to those crossroads in our life, we have to ask ourselves, what is our life going to be about? Is it going to be about the temporal, or is it going to be about eternal things? And as soon as we make that choice, I want you to know that your heart will have a corresponding or correlation type of formation that begins to take place. If you choose eternity, I'm going to start living my life for eternity, what you will find out is that your heart will immediately begin to expand and begin to grow. Because that's where God's heart is. God wants us to think about eternal issues. And so when we start going down that path and we say, God, I'm just going to start thinking about those kind of things in my life, then we begin to recognize that our heart starts doing a certain type of formation. That's why Proverbs says, watch over your heart with all diligence, for out of it flows the issues of life. And there's no greater issue in life than where you're going to spend eternity. And then the second one is this, that when we choose the temporal, then immediately our hearts grow smaller and colder. And you'll begin to think everything that happens in life is just about you. You know, and God will bring you to a place, friends, in your life that He will say these words. Listen to what Jesus said in Matthew 10:39. Whoever finds his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. In other words, if you'll give your life away for my sake, you're going to find what life is all about. But if you try to keep it and just do everything for yourself, then what you're going to do is absolutely lose it. Had an experience in my life, and believe you me, there are more of them that are happening. But this was one of the most dramatic experiences that I had about these two roads. And it came to the place after I'd started in the ministry in 1981 that the church had grown now to about 200 people, and I was still working for my dad. And he knew that I couldn't stay in the business, so he came to me and basically said, what's going to be your decision? Are you going to stay with me, or are you going to go to the church? And I want you to know that my dad was absolutely supportive of either choice that I was going to make. And so I told him, I said, well, I'll let you know. And so about a week's time after that, I came to him and I said, Dad, I feel like I'm supposed to go to the church. And he says, I think you're making the right choice. He said these words, I'll never forget them. I'll have the papers drawn up so you can sign away your stock and away your position in the company. And I went, sign away? What does that mean, sign away? You know, it's like, oh man, this is big time stuff. You know, I'm really signing it away. And I could take you to 1622 Glenwood in the lobby out there on that long, information desk. And Dad, I don't even know what day of the week it was, but it was in the evening. And he came by and he laid those papers out. And you know, those little stickers that says sign here? You know, so I started signing. And he shook my hand and said, it was nice doing business with you. Turned around and walked out. And I want you to know, this is exactly what was going on in my mind. It was the most freeing experience I think I've ever had in my life. And at the same time, it was the scariest thing I've ever done. I don't know how God does that. But I want you to know, friends, at times in your life, God will bring you to an apex, and He's just going to ask you, where are you going to go? What are you going to do with your life? Is it going to be about me, or is it going to be about you? So we have to decide that. Is my faith just going to be about me, or is it going to be about other people? What God's called us to. Number 2 is this. Think about where my resources will be spent. Now, here's an interesting one. Think about where my resources will be spent. Where will I be spending the resources God gave me? My time, my energy, my giftings. Caution. Let me talk to you about this caution here that I have. Because when I talk to people about this, you know, what is your giftings, where are your resources going to be spent, and all the rest of it, most of the people in this room immediately go to full-time ministry. And let me tell you something. That is not where God has about 90% of you will never ever be in full-time ministry, and you ought to say, thank God. You don't want to be there. And one of the reasons why I really want to kind of develop this whole issue about where you're going to spend your resources is because many of you do have extra time on your plate. You think, well, maybe not. Well, if you cut out some activities, you do. And you're beginning to be drawn towards certain things where we're talking about the sweet spot, where you just know that that's the place that you belong. I happened to watch somebody this week that was ministering, and I was just really on the outside kind of looking in. And as I watched this individual kind of take over the situation and begin to do what they were doing so well, it was just kind of nice to sit back and just watch. You know, that individual has found exactly what they're supposed to do. And it's the first time in history, and I know I'll get in trouble with the bookstore when I say this, but that's where I live most of the time anyway. There's a book that's called From Success to Significance that a guy wrote because of a man by the name of Bob Pax that came up with that particular statement. And he's the man that owns Pax TV. And he just said, you know, I got to a place where I was tremendously successful, but I realized I wasn't doing anything significant. And when this man heard this that wrote the book, said, I've got to write a book about that, and did a whole bunch of research on it, and it's a fabulous read. And here's the point that comes across, that it's the first time in the history of man that man not only has the wealth, but also the health to do something with his life, especially in the second half, simply because he has these kind of resources. And people are just at the point in their life right now where they're asking this question, you know, another boat, another toy, another house, another whatever it might be, just doesn't satisfy anymore. I want to do something that is significant with my life. And so we have to begin to ask ourselves the question, where am I going to spend my resources? What am I going to do with the rest of my life? How is that going to be, as Shalane would say, impactuous upon the people that I'm around? Well, here's where the rubber really meets the road, friends, and we're talking about just really getting it down to plain, simple matters. Every one of us have to decide, am I going to become more sensitive to my surroundings? Because when I become more sensitive to my surroundings, here's exactly what will happen. Your gifting will begin to manifest itself in the condition of what other people's lives are actually taking place. In other words, when you see somebody that is off in the corner by themselves at some kind of party, and you recognize that that person is discouraged, the person with the gift of encouragement is naturally drawn to that person because they want to figure out what in the world is going on with them. You see, and that's where your resources are really going to be dialed up and used, is simply because we are on all the time. It's not that we go into a party or we go into some kind of, social situation and then we're just dialed out of it. We actually are dialed up because we're sensing what God's doing in the room. And the more you use it, the more you will be aware of what God is actually doing in the room. And so you will walk over and you'll begin to ask them questions. And like I talked about last week, you'll start asking questions, saying things that you never thought of before. And it's because that gifting now is being engaged because a person needs the gift. By the way, while I'm talking about this, you don't carry the gift. You don't have it in your hip pocket. It manifests itself at the time because the gift is not for you. The gift is for the person that's receiving what you have to say. You see, and so you're in that position there. So, and then you got these other people that are prophetic, that have the old black and white syndrome. And they see you wallowing in your self-pity, and then they come around and just read your mail, and it's like bullets going off on you, and they can't even stop. And it's like, wow, it's just exactly what I needed to hear, but could you just slow down a little bit? Too much truth. And that's the way that this thing starts to operate, is we begin to recognize at this particular point in our lives that now I'm truly going to be engaged. But here's the coup de grace. Here's the bottom line of everything that I'm saying. We have to ask ourselves this question almost every time we get into those kind of situations. Am I willing to be spent? And see, if I took a survey of us tonight, probably 100% of us could register on the negative side. There have been times when I know I was supposed to engage and I didn't do it, and walked away from that. And then on the other side of this survey, because we are fair and just in this church, is that you would probably answer, there were times that I did engage, and what a wonderful blessing that was. John Wimber used to say this, who was the founder of the Vineyard. He'd always take out a quarter or something in his pocket and he'd go, we're a piece of change in God's pocket, and He can spend us anytime He wants to. It's always been a good illustration. The question is, do we want to be spent? And God has that freedom to ask us, and we also have the freedom to go, don't think so. But if we're going to do the work of an evangelist, then we have to be engaged at those moments. And it just means that we're on all the time. Sometimes that gets wearying. Number 3 is this: choose to be bold when needed. Choose to be bold when needed. Sometimes you and I will be one whom God will use to bring people across the line of faith. We have